computer. Great. No, I'm really, really grateful for you making the time to have this conversation. We've known each other now for what? 2016, could that be right?
Yeah, I was trying to figure that out. I think it's 2016.
Yeah.
Yes. Mm.
And it's nice to see you again because we haven't seen each other for a long time. And you've just published this amazing book. Oh, there we go. And I
Thank
remember
you.
that you like it's as an author, I know how long these projects sometimes take and how long you go pregnant with the kind of the nucleus, the intention of it, and then until it actually comes together and then finds a publisher and is out. How was that journey?
Huh. That's interesting. I think I was on the journey without knowing it
Hmm.
from a long time ago. So we met in 2016, and I think I had just been at Schumacher College that summer.
Hmm.
So I would call that the beginning of the journey because it was the beginning for me of a kind of awakening to an ecological viewpoint in the world. And I had simply been a teacher teaching students. I taught things that, about nature, but as facts, as ideas. Um, and I met Stephen Harding at Schumacher. I just met him. And then right after that, the whole summer course was about the great work. So
Hmm.
afterwards, I was like, oh, what is my great work? And believe it or not, I thought, what would Daniel Wahl do? And the reason I thought this was because I had seen you on a website, and I don't even remember what the website was anymore.
Hmm.
And I had liked what you were talking about. And then I saw that this course and webinar on regeneration was coming up, and so I chose to be a part of it, and then I ended up in Mallorca.
Hmm.
Um, but I also kept saying, okay, so what would Daniel do here? And I saw that you were on LinkedIn,
Hmm.
and I knew nothing about LinkedIn at the time. But I saw that you were publishing articles on LinkedIn, and that was a whole new thing to me. I knew nothing about that. So you were quite a model to me, like along the way of like, how does this happen? How do I do this? Because I literally knew nothing.
Hmm.
Um, and that led to my meeting Dr. Muller, who you've also met,
Yeah.
Martin Lee Muller. And that led to my doing a master's in ecology, sustainability, and nature.
Hmm.
And out of that, I began to question, well, how do teachers develop this? How did I develop this ecological awareness? And how do other teachers develop it? And how might that inform how we teach? So at the end of my master's, also Stephen Harding was very involved in my framing of my master's around. He has like 4 Jungian ways of knowing that he looks through,
Hmm.
and I found myself using that. And then through my master's, I
Sensing,
began.
feeling, intuiting, and thinking.
Yes,
Yeah.
yes, exactly. And in his book, uh, what is it? Nature, science, nature, and Gaia. What is it? Is that what it's called?
Animate Earth, that's the
With
subtitle. Animate Earth
Yes,
is the title.
exactly. Inanimate Earth. This is where he describes those. And so I became quite interested in that, and I did basically narrative analysis with these teachers,
Mhm.
and came to see that yes, all of those were present in their coming to understand their ecological awareness or their ecological entanglement, and much of it from quite a young age.
Mhm.
And at the same time, I discovered that there was also this timelessness, unfettered time in nature that they were allowed to have at that time, and especially in their young age, and also casual mentors and also community often. So this became kind of a basis of thinking through how can we form this? How can this happen in schools? And then I was invited to present at the International Baccalaureate World Conference. And that was when someone came up and said, this should be a book. And I was like, I don't want to write a book alone. So I talked to my school.
Mhm.
And as you saw in the book, eventually 8 teachers were involved in sharing their stories. And it became this beautiful self organizing way of being.
Mhm.
Even when we started the project, I wasn't sure it was going to be a book.
Mhm.
But as I started interviewing them about what they'd done, I started seeing what the students had responded with. I felt that needed to happen, the story needed to go wider. So,
Mhm.
yeah. So I didn't actually, I think, start out thinking there was a book, but then I always say it may have one author, but it doesn't have one authorship.
Mm-hmm.
And this broad authorship, I think, was the ship that sailed it into book form.
So
Mm,
the book is so useful because it actually tells lots of practical examples of how to work at the primary and secondary school level with the kids at the stage they're at in order to invite them into the relational worldview, the participatory worldview, the understanding that pretty much all the wisdom traditions have tried to communicate through the ages,
mm,
that basically what we're looking at and what we're looking out from,
mm.
not as separate as the current
Yes,
Western narrative
yes.
makes us believe. Um,
Mm, mm,
and how was that? Were your colleagues already experimenting with that, or did you invite that way of seeing and being into the
mm,
school and say, would you like to participate and try something out with the students and then see how it worked?
mm. Mostly the latter, but also the former, I think. So there was at least one teacher in the school who had already been part of my master's work
Mm,
and was already sharing and thinking along these lines. I think, and this is part of when I talk in the book about, talk about it. When you start talking about it, you find that there are many people who maybe have said nothing, but are thinking this,
mhm,
or are suddenly propelled into thinking this and realize it's something that's important to them.
mhm,
So what I did, I went to my headmaster and I suggested the idea, and he allowed me to give a presentation for the whole school.
mhm,
And when I did that, there were probably 15 teachers out of a staff of maybe 35
mhm,
who registered interest. They said, "Oh, yeah, this sounds really interesting. This sounds like something that's needed." And then what I did was I set up a Teams, we had a Teams situation at the school. I set up a Teams around it. I shared some articles. Other people shared some experiences they had had. And there began to be this conversation. It was really interesting. This was in the fall of 2021. And, people would meet me at the coffee machine and say, "Oh, how's it going? I heard about this," and share something. And there began to just be this kind of mulling conversation that was going on. And again, it was simply starting. Releasing the topic, I think, is so important. So that happened for quite a while. And then I began actually responding to some people who'd said they were quite interested. I had a few interviews with people, really interesting interviews. I wouldn't say interviews, meetings perhaps, with people who eventually didn't contribute,
mhm,
but shared what they thought and how they were feeling, and became very honest about how they felt. Um, there was one administrator who said to me, "Why can't we be an eco school? We should be an eco school." Got very animated and very excited. So this was also happening around. And then at the same time, there were mostly primary teachers, but also other teachers who were moving toward actually creating an initiative.
mhm,
So yeah, so all of that was going on at the same time. And I had this wonderful experience. I had set up a meeting with primary teachers if they wanted to come. And I didn't set an agenda.
mhm,
I didn't want it to be top down. And this is chapter 3, I think. So when they came in, you could just begin to see what people were thinking and how they were talking. And one woman came in and said, "My kids are off the wall. And maybe if I took them outside more, they would settle down." And somebody else was talking about uh, the idea of sit spot and wanting to try that. And the conversation just flowed.
mhm,
And it also didn't end with any deadlines or any, "you must do this" or "you must do that." Um, it just continued on. And then I would contact people and say, "How's that going? What are you thinking of?" And slowly all of these things happened. And some of them teachers were already planning it. We already had a teacher who took students out every year into the environment,
mhm,
and into the woods with a kind of a forest guide. We already had a teacher who had done a little bit with Sit Spot and wanted to continue that. And then we had new initiatives that came also out of that. And what was also beautiful was watching them bounce off each other, because this is emergence, isn't it? When you
mhm.
have all these
Yeah.
different people and meeting together and their ideas, then these other ideas begin to emerge. So some were already partly formed, some were not formed at all, and then that began to just sort of start through the whole spring, different projects that were going on. So,
And how, like, this has been going on for how many years? And to what extent have are there students in the school that might have experienced
mm,
it in primary and are now in secondary and
mm.
continuing to like is there already a little bit of an experience of what happens if you maintain that way of working over time in the school or
I would like to find that out maybe. I retired a year and a half ago.
Mhm,
Um, so and my students who I had taught, and I write about them a little bit in the secondary section. They graduated last June.
mhm,
Um, some of the things became one-offs, and some have continued, and some have continued more than others.
mhm,
So, and again, I think this is a very ecological process.
mhm,
You know, if you look at cessation in ecology, you know, some things take hold and then some things die off and other things come. You kind of, I think, need to allow for that as an invitation and not a requirement if something is going to thrive, if
mhm,
something is going to take hold well. I feel impatient, but at the same time, I think the process is also important. So the teacher who did the work, she did some work with fourth, fifth, and sixth graders. She had a mixed class, and her sixth graders needed to learn about puberty.
mhm,
And she's the one who said early on, you know, I want students to feel awe. I really want them to feel awe. So she decided to take the whole group and do a unit on cycles
mhm,
because puberty is simply one part of the human life cycle, and there are so many cycles. And so she had the students review some of the cycles that they knew of,
mhm,
and then pick anything that they would like to learn about and look at the cycles that were involved. And she made one small change to the lesson plan. And this is what I think is genius when this happens, is she said, choose something, a cycle that you're interested in, but you need to choose at least one more cycle to connect it to.
mhm. Wow.
And that sounds so small. But then she was talking to a boy, a fourth grader, who was like, I don't know. And she said, well, what do you like? I like pandas. Well, what cycles are there with pandas? I don't know. The life cycle? Yes, life cycle of pandas. So what would be a second cycle? I don't know. What do they eat? Bamboo. Oh, the bamboo cycle. And
Nice.
so this boy presented about how pandas need bamboo, but the bamboo also needs the pandas. And then the water cycle needs the pandas because if they don't eat enough bamboo, the bamboo clogs the water system. And he created this whole understanding of interconnectedness
Mhm.
in grade 4.
Lovely.
It's the beginning of systems thinking. And it was only this one extra instruction.
Mhm,
And I got to work with that student about that whole group of students about seeds and soil. And at the end, I said to them, how many cycles can you see in this? And with this one boy went, oh, the cycles. And
mhm.
you could just see awe, you know, in this understanding that everything's interconnected. So what she has done now is made that a year-long
Mhm,
theme in her class.
mhm,
And every year students present.
mhm.
So yeah, there's something that's happening, you know,
No, I
every
mean,
single year.
it makes me reflect on this incredible question that really shocked me when I first heard it, and I've talked about it quite a lot since, because I just think it hits anybody who's been involved in education as a profound challenge to their raison d'être, and
Mm,
then about 2 minutes later, you kind of go, oh. And that's a question that I heard Manish Jain, who the founder of Ecoversity in India, ask at the Planet Local Summit in Bristol last year. Um,
mhm.
and he just put it out there, said, what if education has been the worst crime committed against humanity ever? And I was like, well, how dare you? And then I was like, oh God, he's like, there's something to it. And when, of course, what we mean with what he means is the kind of education that came in with the Victorian industrialization and the kind of sitting in rows and being prepared for specific jobs, being tram-tracked into specific disciplines, being told that anything to do with nature and connection with nature and holding nature as sacred, being in awe of the larger context was kind of primitive, superstitious stuff, and science and technology would show us how we can tame
Yes.
nature and all that kind of storyline that it runs so deep in how we educate.
Mm, mm,
And I really like this what you named earlier that it's the relational worldview that this book is really about, and
mm,
how to bring that back in. And for me, that hits so close to home because I feel like with my book, I made somehow I didn't communicate it well enough for people not to start thinking of regenerative cultures as some kind of proposition of an ideal future utopia that we need to
mm,
now work towards.
mm,
I didn't highlight enough uh, how, for me, regenerative cultures is the pattern that made us become who we are.
mm,
It's
mm.
it's like being bioregional custodians of the ecosystems that have brought us forth at the scale of that kind of regional way. That is our species evolutionary survival pattern. That is
Yes.
what brought us from being monkeys to being who we are over a
Hmm.
long, long journey. And what
Yes.
we call history, those 10,000 years or 250 years, if you start with the scientific revolution of
Mm,
power over, manipulation of,
mm,
separation from, in order to think about like the Enlightenment. That is a blip in history. That's an experiment. The whole, even the technological culture, a culture that industrializes, that is an evolutionary experiment that is super young.
mm.
We're beginning to see that the context within which we've made that experiment is telling us this isn't going to continue. This is
Yes.
impossible. And we kind of knew it since Limits to Growth, but we have
Mhm.
tried to do otherwise. And so for me, this is so critically important what your book speaks about, because we need to come back to that relational understanding of the only way you can become a self-realized individual,
Yeah.
giving the gift that is unique to you and
Yes.
to every single human being, they have that unique gift, is in service to the context within which you're embedded. Like
Mm.
it's that it's by giving ourselves away and our gift away, we actually fully realize our gift. And
Yes.
and that's what indigenous wisdom all around the world understood, that the entire education system, where education is the tribe you live in, the cultural context, um, is geared towards that moment in the rite of passage of a young person to a mature member in the tribe, where you are given the responsibility of, it's not about
Yes.
just receiving, it's also about contributing. And
Yes.
and yeah, how do you see, like, with that one school that you worked at and the experiments you write about in the book, um, have they changed the culture of the school a little bit? Have they, is there still stuff continuing, or is, because and that's not a, like, is it success or failure? Because what
Hmm.
exactly what you were alluding to earlier
Hmm.
is
Hmm.
that the success of it is in every single boy or girl that was in those classes that you write
Hmm.
about, and
Hmm.
in every single teacher, what they're doing now and how they,
Hmm.
um, but
Hmm.
I'm just wondering, has anything spun out from there in the kind of emerging pattern, either within the school or taken to other schools?
Hmm. Um, yeah, again, really important question. Let me say something about education first, because I like you, everything that you said is so true. And really, for the most of our existence, we have existed our education has existed as part of the locality, part of the tribe, part of the family, right? And it seems a little ironic that that I was teaching in an international school, because this whole idea of international is even very new, right? But certainly this idea, we're actually perpetuating the separation from nature in schools since the Industrial Revolution. This is how this understanding has been perpetuated. So yes, it is one of the most terrible crimes that we have done, is to take young children who don't have a sense of separation, right, and school it into them.
Exactly, exactly.
This is
That's Manisha's
yes,
point. Yeah.
absolutely. So as far as my school is concerned, there are, at the very end of the book, I talk about islands of coherence, and I think there are islands of coherence that still exist. I think that we and many other schools are a long way from developing that ecological ethos that I call for at the end of the book, and still looking for ways to develop that, because simply because that sense of traditional education is so strong. We're working so against so many things, including testing in the IB system so that students are prepared for the future, including all of society's pressures, which then pressure schools not to change, right? So there's still so much of that. And I think I said at one point that it's sort of like trying to, remake the airplane while you're flying, and you still have all the constraints of, what you need to do to stay up in the air. But what I see happening is, first of all, the garden continues, and the garden meals continue. There are times when we thought that it wouldn't. There have been many, setbacks from time to time. We just had our garden meal for the year, and some years they've been bigger and some years they've been smaller. This year we fed the entire primary school and had food left over for the students who had helped to prepare it, the middle and high school students, and for staff. So that continues, and the nice thing about that is it's so cyclical. And that has actually become, yeah,
It's one way to just anchor a lot.
yeah, absolutely. And I always say that, like, planting a garden is so much more than just the garden, because the students learn patience, and they learn anticipation, and then they learn beauty and awe, and they learn about cycles, and they learn about care. There's so much that goes into that, right? And they learn that things die. They learn that sometimes it doesn't grow, and they learn to deal with that disappointment. There's amazing things that happen
Yeah, I mean,
in the garden.
my daughter's in a school that also has a garden, and at the moment, I mean, she's 7 years old. They're taking care of cappuccinos. What are they called again? Nasturtiums.
Yes.
And just the way Lucia is now reflecting about how some kids just don't have the attention of understanding every evening, every day I need to water. Others
Yeah.
overwater to the point that and so that you learn so much, even that too much care can also not be helpful. And then the way they teach each other about how to properly take care of just something as simple as a nasturtium,
Yeah.
it's wonderful.
Yeah. Yeah. And you learn to relate to the nasturtium, because you understand that, oh, that was too much water. The nasturtium didn't like that.
Yeah.
There's an actual other
Yeah.
that you begin to be aware of.
Yeah.
I think that's amazing, right? So yes, so the Green Squad is also continuing. That's the middle years group that was working with the plants and planting the plants. That group has not been as involved with the garden this year, but they did help to take the soup around when we made it this year. So there are things that are continuing, and yes, they're building a sense of culture, especially in the primary school, around the garden. But also there's an ESS class, that's Environmental Systems and Societies, in the high school, that has consistently been involved in working with the soil in the spring and helping to make sure that the soil is good and learning through that. And that has continued to happen every year. And that group, I had ended up giving presentations on deep ecology too. So things are actually moving, like a little new thing happening. And because of my last conversation with them, we're now looking at putting together a little podcast with some of those students about how they're beginning to understand. So, um, so the through line, there are some through lines, and then there's these other branches that are moving from place to place. So I would say in the full culture of the school, a lot of teachers are still concentrated on like teaching their subjects and getting their students through their exams and so on. But there is a, let's call it a counterculture that is growing as well. Yeah. And of course, we're always coming up, the question is always, where do we find the time for this? And I should also mention that all of these teachers did this on their own time. All of them, though, did it within the constraints of the school and curriculum. The school offered clubs, or the school, or those were units that were already existing in the school. But also, when they're talking about time, I really like the one on sit spot, because the teacher who did sit spot, she said to me, I thought that if I take a half an hour out to take the kids and to do sit spot with them and come back, that I'll get behind. But instead, they're so concentrated, and they're so calm, and so much more gets done. So that even the issue of time is something that is maybe shifting a little bit.
What an important lesson to learn at that age, because I remember how long it took me to understand that taking time out to
Mm,
exercise in nature to recharge my batteries was
mm,
particularly important on those days where I said, today I don't have time for this. Uh,
yeah.
like that, those were the days where I had to do it. And
Mm,
for years, I would then fall into the habit of going into a negative cycle because I wasn't giving myself the recharging balance in order to
mm,
actually be effective in my work when I was
yeah.
getting too much work. And bringing that in early is really so important.
Yeah.
But I could imagine that simply the book coming out will
Mm,
indirectly put a lot, no, I, let's frame it positively, have a catalytic effect at the school, because
mm,
suddenly there will be an international attention to, you did that, that was at your school, wasn't it? And so they
yes.
will be kind of having to answer those questions of, what's still going on of these things that were mentioned in the book.
Yes.
And
Yes.
likewise, there is such a hunger among educators. Like through my work with Guy Education, and over the years, Guy Education has also had multiple requests of adapting the four-dimensional curriculum that was developed 20 years ago, um, which is all around how do we create by introducing the worldview into this as the fourth dimension of sustainability or appropriate participation in the larger system we're part of. Um, it introduced that ability to reflect on how we act because of how we view the world. And
Mm,
and for me, that also brought in to the curriculum the regenerative aspect of a continuous learning in relation to, like, again, the relational participatory worldview. And what happened there was that adults who would take the course in order to learn more about how to kind of work with their transition town or work with their community, very few of them actually wanted to start an eco-village. Um, would then often the educators would say, I want to take this to schools. And then the first experiment that started, and there's some schools that were specifically set up with that intention, but only
mm,
few and far between, two or three. But
mm,
there's now more and more schools who are really hungry for learning both the curriculum, the content, but also the methodologies of teaching, the kind of song and a dance, the community
mm,
glue binding activities that Guy Education developed over the years. And what I'm noticing is that
mm,
there's a
mm,
hunger among educators. Like there are conferences now everywhere about how can we do this different. And
mm,
but what I often kind of question myself, or question in this context, is also, as you were speaking earlier, we are still stuck with the systemic organization of our society in such a way that we're talking about how would we change schools, but maintain schools. And with that, we
Yes.
maintain the separation of like learning becomes like the flip from education to learning, um, from inculturation to enabling to respond to a shifting context throughout your life. That's a very
Yes.
different, like, I mean, it is a dual role. I think education needs to somehow enculturate and tell you what's okay and what's not okay, some sort of value norming. But but if it does it too much, it clips the wings of.
Mhm.
So how do we work with that and also with the being stuck in this idea of that education happens in the first third of life, then people go work and then they retire, which is just completely anachronistic to what's coming at us.
Mm.
How do you see these things ideally transforming?
Yeah, there's several questions there.
Exactly.
Um, First of all, I think like there's room for many movements, and every movement can have impact on the others. So the school that I was working in, the school that I've been teaching in all my life, is an international baccalaureate, heavily academic school.
Mhm.
But there are many other schools, Steiner schools and Montessori schools and open schools and uh, dem- democratic schools that are also forming, you know? And I think that if we open up to hearing from each other, perhaps, again, that's where emergence comes,
Mhm.
a kind of ecology of schooling, we can all move closer to that participatory understanding that we need. And some of us are more ingrained, for instance, IB schools are very ingrained in the academic college world
Mhm.
um, in certain places. And maybe we can loosen, all of us can loosen a little bit, right? And at the same time, there's unschooling that can happen. And there's schooling in the world that can happen. And I think must happen if we're going to have that participatory relationary understanding of the world, not just in gardens, but like everywhere, and in the woods and around us. So this again is, I see it as a very small step, but an opening of the conversation and also an opening of maybe opening up to other opportunities that actually do exist,
Mhm.
other types of schooling that do exist, not to mention indigenous schooling that exists within tribes or within communities. Like there's so many examples that we could, as humans, I'm talking now, as humans, make um, make part of our discussion,
Mhm.
make part of our direction. Once we loose ourselves from, perhaps we would call it the tyranny of the system. So, you
Yeah.
know, Bayo Kamalafe talks about, there's that wonderful essay where he talks about doorways and cracks. And he says, I don't trust doorways. Doorways lead to hallways and containment. I think of schools when I think of this. And then he says, I like cracks.
Mhm.
And I love that because cracks are where things, the old begins to break down. And it's also where, you know, the soil settles in and something grows, right?
Yeah.
So,
Makes me remember my favorite Leonard Cohen line, "Ring the bells that still can ring,
yes,
get your perfect
absolutely.
offering."
That
It's
is where,
and everything. That's how the light gets in.
that's how the light gets in.
Yeah.
And that's so true. And so maybe, you know, what we're doing is allowing for cracks,
Mhm.
right? Because these structures are preponderous and not fit for purpose.
That
And more people are seeing that. So I don't know if I've answered all the questions.
yeah, but the more we go back to it, it's just that no, you made me like the now I lost where I wanted to respond to what you just said. Yeah, the it's related to the other questions you haven't got to yet, which is as we think of education and interventions in education, if like what I'm noticing is everything is up for grabs for redesign and needs urgently to be restructured. And we're having conversation about the future of work, the future of education, the future of community, the future of energy, the future of water, and
Yes.
whatever.
Mm. Mm.
And for me, particularly the conversation around the future of work and the future of education is so linked. And
Mm.
and what we've eroded away by this individualistic teachings that it's we're separate and therefore it's competitive and you don't depend and you like can't step over all these things that falls on this misunderstood kind of neo-Darwinism
Mm.
justified in society as oh yeah that's just how it is
Mm.
like the whole competition that is sort of so story told into us that
Mm.
we justify it. Um,
Mm.
what what it also has done is it eroded these educational learning systems that indigenous people had, which are tribal. They're not in separate age forms. The learning is by breaking down those boundaries between are you a school age kid now, therefore you can't be involved with this other adult who's running a small local company, growing local food, or being a local carpenter, or being the local baker. Like if we actually reinvented work and education together in a way that we created these new opportunities of building intergenerational ties and relational fields again
Mm-hmm.
that are deeply rooted in place. Uh,
Yes. Yes. Mm.
yeah,
Mm.
just
Absolutely. Um, and how do we get there from where we are? Um, I always say one step at a time, you know?
right.
So part of what I was saying in the book is Earth Words. The title of the book is Earth Words for a reason. Because it's a journey, first of all. And as much as I want to say I want to be there now, I'm aware that we have to start where we are. And every teacher, every educator has to start where they are. Some of them are maybe further along if we imagine earthwards like a, a line over a fulcrum, and we want to get to that point where we tip, right? We want those tipping points to happen. Some of us might be further along than others, but everybody matters where they are. Like you were saying, each individual's individual gift is important, and each individual is more or less aware of their individual gift as well, right? And then at the same time, each of us where we are confronted with acts every day in our lives where we can choose whether we move earthward or not, right? It might be personal acts, it might be reflection, it might be teaching, it might be uh, standing up and saying something when you have the opportunity. But if each of us makes that act where we are earthward as much as we can, as far as we can, as quickly as we can, right? And without guilt, I think is really important. Without guilt and without shame, right? That we are where we are. Um, that I believe is the best chance we have for moving across the fulcrum, for creating that tipping point. And it's super important to me that we do that as community, that wherever we are, we create community to do that because community creates more weight, right? On the fulcrum, if you want to take it that way. And so creating the community and then creating our or developing our own individual potentials, because it is each individual potential coming together which creates the emergence. And so developing our own potential, finding the others, right? In community. And also, I very much believe in finding the others in our local community because that's what matters. But also sometimes we need the others in our extended, what do you want to call it, global online community because they nourish us again, as you nourish me now. And sometimes if you're completely alone in your community, you do need that as well. But then talk in your community. And like I said before, you suddenly find that there are people that are thinking and wondering and wanting to attempt, right? So I think as much as it sounds like maybe it can't get there, it is the only way to get there, is to move from where you are. And for each person to then each person then influences other people. And I like to say that, in a complex system, you don't have linear movement, and you simply cannot know what is affecting what, right? And since you can't know, you have to do what you can. That's the
one thing that I learned, one thing that my conversations with Bioma Komolafe and Nora Bateson have triggered in me over the last year and a half, in terms of questioning my own, like doing my own unlearning or repositioning of frameworks, is this invitation to understand that the part of the Western cultural education process, that normative education, is to pay attention pretty much solely to the agency that we have as individuals. Like the whole blah, blah, blah about change makers. Oh, everybody needs to be a change maker. Yeah? But what we're not paying attention to enough in our education system is that since we are living in a relational world as a participatory, embedded, complex system that isn't separate, the agency of the system that brought us forth is so much larger than the agency of the individual that is acting within that system. And we are now at a point where I feel that fulcrum that you're speaking about and the earthwardness it's not a one-way process. The earth is coming towards us. Gaia is coming towards us in a way that is not all the loving embrace. It's also the lesson of you have disregarded me for so long, and that has consequences. And yeah, not in a bad child, I will scold you now. Just that we're a whole and like one living earth, and your behavior has had and will have consequences. And so I feel that there's much of this complex redesign about how we do things is of what I was kind of talking about. How would we break down these categories of work and education and bring all kind of intergenerational community back? I think it will in large part be a necessity that is actually going to change us. And that invites educators today into a different type of working, which is rather than creating individualistic change agents, is creating the capacity to sit in circle and say, what next? To really to fall together rather than to fall apart. And the structures that we have taken for granted suddenly evaporate.
Absolutely.
So
no, I think that's absolutely true. And I think that the one thing that we can offer is I'll back up and say one of the reasons that I think it's so important to make that relational connection to the rest of the living world is to understand, first of all, that we're not separate, but also to understand a sense of beauty and connection that can keep us moving forward, even as some of the worst things that we've been talking about come to pass. Because I think that we're at, well, I know that we're at a stage where many of the things that we said, oh, well, if we don't reach this, this might happen, that might, many of those things will happen. I find I'm not very sure I understand how to talk about the world of work when I think the world of work may not exist the way we imagine it right now. But I think the best thing we can do is create young people who have that deep understanding of who we are, that deep understanding of our connectedness with the rest of the living world, so that, as you say, we can ask the questions, so that we can, as I said before, loosen ourselves from those things which are going to begin to be falling apart, and definitely falling apart for them, as they are looking at what they will do in the future. There may be completely different options from what we supposedly teach them to do. And so they have to be both aware and flexible and resilient. Um, and I often think that this is something, but it's something between hope and doom, right? And as teachers, we're also always also in that dilemma of how do I hold these students and care for these students in their increasing malaise and their increasing anxiety, because they are also aware, right? Um, while also being aware myself of some of the very serious consequences that are coming, but also helping them to be tethered to the larger picture, to the understanding of system, to the understanding of our belonging to Earth, right? To the understanding of cycle, to the understanding of loss as well, because part of that is part of what happens in the world. That we Westerners just don't ever want to talk about loss or death. That can't be part of the conversation. So, but all of that has to become something that we engage with young people in, um, helping them to then become um, deeper humans, more fully human, so that they're able to respond to what will come in the way that it comes. Somewhere in the beginning of the book, I said that a young person who has understood their relation with the rest of the world, if they become an artist, will do different art.
Mhm.
If they become, a doctor, will do their skills with an understanding of the connectedness, or a lawyer, or whoever they become, they will do this in a way that respects our becoming part of the rest of the living world, right? And then again, there may not be positions for doctors and lawyers in a lot of places, or any of those things, and then be able to be flexible for what comes next, how we be together in community.
See this, reminding me again that the school you were in, and that the book speaks about is an international school,
Mm,
made me reflect a little bit on the situation here on Mallorca with different schools, and there's also
mm,
international schools,
mm,
semi-private schools, and so on, and how around the world there are parents that send their kids to an international school, in part because they are like the parents are the globalization generation
mm,
that feels that the more global access you have through speaking multiple languages, and the more you're in contact with other kids whose parents are binational, like third culture kids, like my daughter,
mm,
and they celebrate this being part of the international community. You hear it a
mm,
lot also in Latin America and
mm,
yeah, it is. And more and more, my work is focusing on the coming home to place, the need to set that enabling constraint of saying, this is my bioregion. This is where
mm, mm,
it doesn't need to be a birth bioregion, but at some point there needs to be this commitment to the specificity of a particular place over the long term, in
mm,
order to actually build the depth of relational understanding in
mm,
the concrete, not in the abstract.
mm,
Like in the specificity of one place and its culture and its ecosystem and its climate.
mm,
I'm just wondering, how do we bring that like back into education? Because it's particularly in the context of what we were just talking about, that
mm,
we now no longer can be the change agents that will co-create that wonderful future. We can, and we also have to accept that the system will fundamentally change the playing field for us,
mm,
as we're
mm.
doing this.
Yeah.
And for me, if we don't come back to our cultural pattern,
Mm,
that is our species survival pattern of being bioregional regenerators, careful custodians of the ecosystems that we
mm,
depend on,
mm.
save the planet by saving places. We don't we don't have a chance.
Yeah.
And how do we, in a world where internationality is still so valued,
Mm,
bring
mm,
kids into this invitation to say you don't have to work in Shanghai for a while and then in the city of London and then do an internship in Australia before you
mm,
settle
mm,
down for 2 years where the best job is, which is
mm.
kind
Yeah.
of what a lot of upper middle class kids get taught as the desirable way of living
Yeah.
your life.
Yeah. Um, well, and I've been an international school teacher.
Yeah, exactly. That's why
Um,
I'm asking you.
and and yet at the same time, I've always well, I have three ways of being local. I lived in Cyprus for 20 years, but I lived on the land in Cyprus, and my kids were very involved in the village, right? Their own village. Um, and in Norway, I have bought this piece of land, which is a permaculture uh, farm, basically. And that is one of the things I was able to offer to my school is, well, I have goat poop and hay and all this stuff to bring. Um, so, but also, as you said before, we have to work from our own location, and my location has been an international school.
Mhm.
So I might have gone somewhere else to a local school, but my location was where it was.
Mhm.
So that's my first thought around that. Well, at the same time, what you said about this idea of international schools being very important in the world and maybe having prestige as well, I see that as also an opportunity.
Mhm.
Because, for instance, if international baccalaureate schools begin to understand and practice this relational and participatory understanding of who we are in the world, then we're not talking about just one place in the world where that happens, but multiple places throughout the world where that happens, right? And then spreads locally, I think. So for instance, I've been talking with teachers in Norwegian schools, and a lot of teachers in schools go, oh yes, Norwegian schools, almost every high school or at least every community now has an international baccalaureate program at their high school. So, and I was talking to a Norwegian headmistress the other day, and she was like, this has to be in all the IB schools in Norway. But then that trickles down into the actual society, into the actual culture. So there's the opportunity to be for an impetus in many places. But
Mhm.
then that has to percolate. That has to move into the society and into the grounds. Um, and I actually quote you in the book when I'm talking about economics and about that. And actually, because I look at some of the takeaways at the end, the next last chapter of the book, and one of the takeaways is has to be local.
Mhm.
It has to be local. And one of the reasons it has to be local is, I think you just alluded to, is about empathy.
Mhm.
Because what you get in international schools a lot of times is, oh, here, do a jogathon and raise money for that thing over there, right? And you
Mhm.
have all these kids participating, and then the money is gathered. And that's what they actually see is money. They don't see the need, they don't see the other people, they don't see the the care, right? And that is it's so separated in so many different ways, both in terms of like actual care for actual people in another place or an actual place in an actual place, and just this stuff, this money, right? So when you get local and you're building a garden, then your care and your empathy is real. It's connected to real things and not just to this idea of, I almost want to say throwing money at, but that can create a culture of, oh yes, I gave at the office, right? If you create that culture that is out there somewhere instead of local.
Mhm.
So definitely being involved locally is absolutely important.
I, I
Um,
I just can't remember at the moment what they're called, but you remember the network of schools that Kurt Hahn created. They like they're schools that pride themselves on having this. I mean, they're often international schools, private schools, but they like all the students are either in the local voluntary fire brigade, or the
Mm.
like basically real community engagement process,
Yes.
even to the point that if there is a fire drill, um,
Mm.
and they're setting an exam, the kids that are part of the fire brigade
We'll
run
go.
the exam and do their thing. And then it's
Mm.
a really lovely way of bringing that sort of community relatedness and embeddedness into the secondary school curriculum. I mean, I think they
Yes.
only do it with the sort of 13, 14-year-olds upwards, but
Mm.
that's um, like we could do so much more, I feel, of breaking down, like particularly, I mean, in a way, the school garden does so, but imagine you go beyond that school garden and you go into a relationship with local farmers. And,
Yes.
and,
Yes.
and you begin to kind of look at food, water, and local materials
Yep.
in a way that involves the farmers, and where the
Yes.
school that has a sort of certain capacity to do local provisioning. Like if the
Mhm.
school might not have a lot of money, but it does spend some money on food. So why not build that money into weaving stronger local relationships and
Yes.
and
Yes.
create a multiplier where it's not about just spending on food, but actually creating a new way of teaching our children in connection with a local farmer.
Yes. Yes.
But it's
And
what the tragedy is that even in private schools that have a little bit more funding, people are so stressed that making these larger transformations is just doing that on top of the
yeah,
daily business is asking too much of people, unfortunately. And
it
it's
is.
and for small school, like for public like state schools, it's even more so.
Yeah.
So it's a
Although there is maybe the opportunity for those types of things to happen. I mean, I'm just talking about in my own experience now, as more um so one of the things that I did with the book was I started a website which is called the Earthwards Community. And there, I've been surprised because I was thinking that when the book came out, that was when like teachers bought it, that they would join the community. But instead, it's got over 100 people in it already of all kinds of persuasions of people that are doing so many different things. Just yesterday, I think it was, somebody joined who is involved in working with kids to plant trees in cities, for instance. And
Mhm,
so one of the reasons that I started that was to share initiatives,
mhm,
because the more people, like somebody, whatever happens in your location has to come out of your environment, your ecology, your niche, but you might be influenced by something that you see somewhere else, another story.
mhm,
So all of these stories are important in us finding what has to happen here where we are, right? And then the stories that we tell can go out for others.
mhm,
But I'm already finding that one of the things that can happen there is that then schools become connected, and the international school becomes connected to a local school who is also embedded in that. And then you can have these types of things. So in our school, so far it's been our farm here that students have come to and been involved with and so on. But they have met, for instance, when we had a first grade class and a fourth grade class come here together. It was not only, the age groupings that changed, but my neighbor came from across the road and he was just calmly swinging his smoke for his beehives,
mhm.
and to just watch these kids just turn and look at him, and they just followed him, and he took them up to the hive, not a word, right? And then gently showed them the bees. And I don't think they'll ever forget that.
Mhm.
And it just came by like being there in the position, and he knew they were there. He came to do this, but it was just beautiful, absolutely gorgeous. Um, so that I think that if we link with our stories to others who are building their stories, we can begin to create
Mhm.
this deeper connection. I
There's
hope.
no there is no other way. And
There is no other way.
yeah,
And also you made a
it's not
comment that I
one that
want to
will take
answer.
us into a longer future. I mean, there
Yeah,
are ways, but
yeah,
they're unfortunate short dead ends.
yes. And you said something that I wanted to respond to, because you said something about crisis, and crisis is what also fuels evolution.
Mhm. Absolutely.
Every new evolutionary progress has come out of crisis. And as much as we might not want that to happen and hope that it may not have to happen, really to a terrible extent, I think that crisis does drive change.
Yeah, it's
Um,
this understanding that crisis in its traditional uses of the word, and particularly in
mm,
medical terms,
mm,
is not the point of inflection towards complete and utter disaster and end of story. It is
mm,
actually a point of inflection towards health.
yes,
Like when the fever breaks, like when you is there's this point where you need to have this crisis in order to move into the next pattern, and I
yes,
think that's where, and even in this, like we don't like talking about death, as you pointed out, in our culture, and we certainly don't like talking about collapse. And there's fear about when you talk about it too much, then people will be scared, and you will be have panic reactions, and
mm,
that's not going to
mm,
serve. And
mm,
so finding new ways of talking about collapse as almost there's the bright side of collapse, that there are certain patterns, if we do not um, have them break down sooner rather than later, we
mm,
will be in worse state. Life will be in a worse state
yeah,
in even 50 years from now. And so understanding that, like, letting go of certain patterns that no longer serve, and that kind of collapse can actually open opportunities that will then allow us to be healthier again in our
mm,
relationship to ourselves, to each other, and to our places, the places we
yes.
dwell in. Yeah.
But also to create those stories now that can hold us through that, I tell my students, the story of the caterpillars and butterflies, right? So that when a caterpillar is becoming a butterfly, it actually does, I mean, talk about crisis, it dissolves.
Mm.
And if you were in the mind of the caterpillar, you would definitely think that it's over, right? Um, and yet it's so important that I also think it's beautiful that the cells that are going to become the butterfly are called imaginal cells.
Mhm.
I just, it's crazy. I was telling my students this, so like, really, you made that up? I was like, I did not make that up. That's actually what they're called. Um, but that it's so important that those imaginal cells find each other.
Mhm.
And it's so important. I think the one thing that we can be doing as we see deterioration happening or dissolving happening, or however you want to name what is happening to the current body, that we focus on becoming our best imaginal selves and finding the others, and joining together, because that is where the new will come from, right? So then again, I come back to the importance of talking about it, the importance um, of sharing stories, because that is how we build culture in our societies or in our species, right? And developing that new growth, new body coming. Mm.
And what's so important in all of this is also, like, again, coming back to the relational worldview and understanding that we are life.
Yes.
Because if you really take that home to its utmost and you understand what Goethe so beautifully put 200 years ago, that death is life's ingenious way to create plenty of life,
Mm-hmm.
then a culture that is capable of thinking in that way and capable of understanding the relatedness in terms of, if I heal, nurture into higher states of abundance and productivity my local ecosystem, ultimately myself, my family, and my descendants will have a better life.
Mm-hmm.
This relational, then we can actually, in the midst of the absolute calamity of breakdown, chaos, and being the caterpillar dissolving, um, let go and
Yeah.
not be fearful of an end, because we know that we're feeding into life. Like,
Mm. Mm.
it's again, it's that ancient wisdom that we've tried to carry in wisdom traditions around the world, that eternal life is not living forever as an individual. It's
Mm.
life being eternal. And
Mm-hmm.
so
Mm-hmm.
the access to eternal life and our way into the future, hopeful, like the hopeful way into the future, is by aligning with life. And
Mm-hmm.
and it's almost paradoxical in the sense for me that it's if we align with life to the point that we don't care so much anymore whether we or our species survive, but we care more about whether Earth, like the living fabric, that we're part of survives and thrives in the future.
Mm-hmm.
It's
Mm-hmm.
exactly at that point where we let go of wanting to live forever that we
Yeah.
might find a way to wisely live a lot longer than if we
Mm.
don't have that perspective.
Mm. Mm. And we find I come back to that, and we find also the ability to accept um, uncertainty
Mm.
and the ability to embrace both uncertainty, but also the beauty and the meaning. There is meaning to be had that we have lost, you
Mm.
know, so that in embracing this relationality and embracing this understanding of who we are in the world, we open ourselves up both to embracing the uncertainty, but also to embracing the beauty of living, the
Mm.
beauty of life, and also the meaning, that there's meaning in that. And I think a lot of young people these days, they're missing meaning,
Mm.
because if meaning isn't in economic, wealth, and it isn't in, just getting more stuff, where's the meaning, right?
Sit right.
So there's a crisis of meaning in understanding that we can't continue to live the way we've lived. And what's happening with a lot of young people is they're quickly understanding we can't continue to live the way we live or have lived, but they are then at a loss what to replace that with in terms of meaning.
Yeah, absolutely. Like, I mean,
Yeah.
I was going for a hike with a group of other parents and their kids on the weekend, and one of them is a teacher, and he was sharing with me that 70% of the kids that he teaches, they're kind of 14, 15, when you ask them what they want to be, they say influencer.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, that for me, that it shows that there's a crisis of meaning.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
but
If they understand, I had, I had a group of I was teaching 16-year-olds, and what changed for me was we had a unit every year, which was, what would you call your generation?
Mhm.
And the moment that everything changed for me was when a boy looked at me and said, "We're the generation not much longer." And I would say that an increasing number of young people
That, yeah.
understand that, right? And I had students 7 years ago say, "Oh, we're Greta," right? And then they went through a stage where they wanted to be influencers. But I think now they're realizing that that's not there either, you
Mhm.
know? So, how do we hold them? How do we offer them? Um, and then at the end of the book, I quote the student who came in the last year who said to me, and we were having a unit, actually, it was a geography unit on weather and climate. And she was sitting in the front row, and she was a very serious student. And she said, "Miss, do you think we're going extinct?" You know? And what hurt, what hit me was also that she said that we're going extinct, but also she said, "Miss, do you think?" Because it is a direct request for us to involve ourselves with them, to engage with them with what they are already thinking, already concerned about, right?
Basically, they see our cognitive dissonance, but
Yeah,
while we are
yeah,
in denial and
yeah,
culturally embedded
yeah,
through
yeah,
roles and
yeah, yeah,
obligations and needing to earn money and whatever, to
yeah,
just continue with the cognitive dissonance and
yeah,
have that perverse life where how we live our life and what we do does not make sense in comparison to what we actually know of where we're at this point in
absolutely.
human affairs. And the kids are
Mm,
kind of going,
yeah,
don't you see
yeah.
that you're still running towards the cliff?
We're
So,
not doing them any favors by ignoring it and
and
pretending
the,
that everything will be okay.
and the biggest favor of, and this would fundamentally shift education and intergenerational relationships, is if we actually said we were wrong.
Yeah,
Because it's still so like no like this ingrained authoritarian attitude of well, better not admit to the young ones we were wrong, and like just muddle through and oh, things have changed, blame something else. But to
Mm.
actually say, no, we were fundamentally wrong, and this
Yeah.
worldview was fundamentally wrong, and what we're
Mm.
chasing was fundamentally wrong.
Yeah.
That would make a difference.
Because I would argue that they know that already. I would
Exactly,
argue they know that.
exactly.
And
But it
then
would be a relief
actually my
to
yeah,
hear it.
my headmaster said, they can smell, our hypocrisy a mile away. Hmm.
Uh,
Hmm.
well, thank you. This was really lovely, and
Hmm.
looking forward to sharing that with people because I think that, as I said, like there are just a huge amount of people in education at the moment that are hungry to do things differently,
Hmm.
and
Hmm.
precisely because of where we ended up, because they see that no, I just can't pull this off anymore. I can't
Yeah.
educate these kids for a world that will not exist
Hmm.
when they actually supposed to take the roles we're now preparing them for.
Yes. Yes.
How do I educate them for some in a way that even if we don't know what world the world will be like when they take a role, that they are capable of taking roles in an uncertain world, and that it's
Yes.
very different than
Hmm.
I want my son to be a whatever investment banker in the city of London. There's not much to be invested in the future. The way.
Hmm. Hmm.
So, maybe just before we end, what's next for you? I mean, you said you're retired, but you don't as a person who would ever retire.
Yeah. Um, I didn't know when I wrote a book that what comes with that, first of all, is like 2 years of editing. But then even after the book is out, what comes next is like all the going around in book launches and everything else. Um, so that's been kind of a whirlwind that I sort of didn't expect. And I definitely expect to keep being involved with the school. I'm still involved with the garden, still involved with the school has now bought a cohort of books. So one of the things that I'm going to be doing is I've been offering a free online author-led book course.
Nice.
Yeah. So I
Everybody,
really would
internationally, or is that
yeah,
yeah.
internationally. So there's two different iterations. One of them I'm going to start right after in the new year, and that's for like anyone who has a book and wants to join. It's basically every two chapters of the book, so it's over 8 weeks, and it's free. And I'm going to be putting it out in different places. And it's what I want is an opportunity for people to come together. For me, this is constantly what matters, right? So it's an opportunity to come together to discuss maybe some of the reflections in the book, because as you saw, I have reflections for the reader in the book. Discuss what you might do or how you might work with these ideas in your school and have that be interactive so other people are also getting ideas at the same time. Um, and then within schools, there being cohorts that come together around reading the book and also within their school then build their initiatives and their ideas. And I've said that for me, a cohort can be any number of people. It can be two if there are two people who are really engaged. It's just a matter of people coming together, somehow encouraging people to come together and discuss and think about these ideas. So my school has bought a set of books, and so has another school, and there's another school in Geneva which is going to be running a course around a set of schools of books. So I think that maybe that will be growing, and I will be involved as much or as little as they like. But one thing like I said, I'm willing to, as retired, offer things for free, what I can. So I'd like to offer that for anyone who's interested. Um, yeah, and maybe do some overland. We're not going to fly, but my husband and I might um, take the electric car and see how far we can get into Europe and meet some of the people that we've met and do some of that.
Come to
Don't know
Europe?
if we could get to Mallorca, maybe.
Um,
Yeah.
Lovely. No, and um, these groups or these communities of practice, or Could they also involve students, or is it more the teachers in the school? Because it'd be particular. I mean, maybe only the slightly older ones, but
Yeah,
it'd be lovely
yeah,
to have them involved.
yeah. I'm excited to see how that might happen. There's one school in Dusseldorf that's wanting to do that around the book. And the teacher who is leading that is in this Earthwords community website that we've started. And so I'm very curious to see how that works with students, how they work with that, and how that maybe brings in teachers as well. You know, that it goes both ways. And there was another thing, initiative I was thinking of that I can't remember right now that has students. Oh, and then in our own school, this group of students who are willing to be part of a podcast. I'd really like to see students come together and talk about this, right?
That's so nice. Just
Yeah,
having because it's really this intergenerational learning has to go both ways, and it's not
yes.
just about like there's a real need for
Mm-hmm.
people in their 40s and 50s and 60s to actually understand where you are at when you're
Mm-hmm.
15, 16. And
Mm-hmm.
so
Mm-hmm.
when you mentioned that earlier, just I thought I would love to listen to a podcast where 14, 15, 16-year-olds talk about their relationship to the earth and
Yeah.
future and to they because I would love to know how they verbalize it, how they see it, how they feel it, because only then can I really engage with them. If I come in to a school and too much sort of say, don't you see, you need to, that doesn't work. Like
Yeah.
you need to first understand, pick them up where they're at. And so I think it'd be really rich to have more of
Yes.
that.
Yes. I agree. I agree. Hmm.
Lovely. Right. We could talk for hours, but I've learned the hard way is that keeping the recordings to less than 90 minutes makes it
Yes,
more
indeed.
that people um
But it's lovely to talk with you. Amazing to get to talk with you again. So,
lovely.
hmm.
Stop and then we can say goodbye. Where's the stop recording bit? Uh, I've had